Okay, thanks everyone. I'm giving my presentation is about sort of bringing together participatory planning type, like workshop style conservation planning together with spatial conservation planning, using a case study from the Eyre Peninsula. The project that we're looking at is called the Wild Eyre project, focusing on the Western Eyre Peninsula, sort of come up a few times in the conference. It's a collaborative landscape scale conservation project between a partnership of government and non-government organisations, so Greening Australia, Nature Conservation Society of South Australia, Wilderness Society, Doona, and Natural Resources Eyre Peninsula. And a really sort of key theme for the presentation is really about how we link ecological priorities to sort of practical on-ground outcomes. And in my experience, ecologists and GIS nerds like myself sort of tend to think a bit differently to really sort of practical on-ground types that are busy getting on with doing stuff. Like they tend to be focused on just which landholders they can engage and sort of get an outcome with, and don't necessarily get a chance, like I do, to sort of sit back and look at the big picture, the sort of landscape scale stuff, and think about, in that sort of idealised kind of environment, what we really ideally should be doing. We've been using a globally recognised conservation planning framework to sort of systematically step through the planning steps, and the process is called, the framework's called the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation, also known as CAP or Conservation Action Planning. It's pretty well sort of established in South Australia, so a lot of you might have sort of heard of projects on the Yorke Peninsula and living in the Flinders Ranges using a similar kind of process. But the really sort of key thing about it is that it's used all over the world, so you can go and talk to people working on chimps in Tanzania, and they'll be using the same planning framework. It's not because it's sort of some sort conceptually superior or anything like that. It's really just that it's a bit unique in that it all stages of the process kind of have a workshop style component to them. So there's a really strong focus on adaptive management and sort of learning by doing, and reiterating the plan as we move through time, which is, if you think about it, it's really important for sort of long-term type conservation sort of goals. If you're really committed to seeing something through, you need to really be doing it and refining your approach over something like a 20-year period, which is difficult to do, but if you have a strong, committed group of people, you can sort of get there. So I'll just quickly step through. So it's, these are the conceptual steps. It's about understanding what the components sort of biodiversity are in your landscape, the different assets, ecosystems, and then basically stepping through and saying what makes them tick, what are their key ecological attributes, how healthy are they currently, what are the critical threats, and then sort of understanding the situation at the site in terms of the drivers of those threats, if the landholders are overgrazing, why are they doing it, all that sort of stuff, to develop conservation strategies. So in a nutshell, what's broken and needs fixing, and how do we fix it, and what are the highest priorities? Okay, so in just sort of focusing the rest of the talk on one of our sort of conservation strategies, really there's a whole lot of great stuff happening, but this is sort of focused around sort of landscape scale revegetation. And these are the sort of components of the landscape as we've kind of divided them. And you can see, if you just note there, that those green areas, the she-oak grassy woodlands, the really open woodland systems, which occur on those sort of more fertile soils. Since European settlement, they're overwhelmingly what's sort of been lost out of the landscape. And some of the more open woodland systems are still sort of grazed quite hard, quite heavily. But by and large, it's she-oak woodlands that are broken, if you like. So, in terms of our those sort of conservation strategies that we're focusing on, really it's about strategic revegetation of sheoak grassy woodlands, and we're looking at buffering subcoastal wetlands and granite outcrops as well as part of that strategy. And also sand mallee remnants are sort of the other kind of revegetation focus to a lesser extent, but there are some important areas where we're also sort of thinking about linking and consolidating fragmented areas. So the spatial sort of GIS component of this, so I used a tool initially called the Connectivity Analysis Toolkit, which a lot of you might be more familiar if you're into this space with CircuitScape, but it's a similar kind of tool really for modelling flow through the landscape. And then where you've got those sort of red areas are really where you've got sort of bottlenecks or constrained connectivity. So this is really a layer of showing the connectivity importance, areas of connectivity importance that you might focus on for enhancing or supplementing connectivity. So if I overlay the dark areas there, if you can see the native vegetation and where those sort of red areas are that we might focus on for revegetation. And you can also see that I've added in those, using various GIS techniques, those buffers around those subcoastal wetlands like the Lake Newland system, and if any of you are familiar with that area, and also some of the granite outcrops. So this is really kind of a spatial representation of the strategy that was devised by the project team. But that's still, if we were just to revegetate those red areas, it's still about 16,000 hectares of revegetation. Currently we're managing a couple of hundred hectares per year, which is still sort of reasonably large scale, but even for those really tight kind of connectivity areas, it's still probably going to take us, if we could scale up to 400 hectares per year, it still takes 40 years to achieve. 80 years if we kept going at 200 hectares a year. So it's still a pretty big effort. So prioritisation is pretty essential. So what else do we have to think about other than just a cool spatial model? Well, it turns out that not all of those sort of connectivity areas are equal in terms of the current sort of state of them. So some of those areas are cropland. Some of them are that number 2, sort of quite really shallow rocky soils, because if you know the area, it's really just a calcareous kind of limestone outcrop with really thin skeletal soils over the top of it. And so there are large areas that are just grazed, and you've got really thin soils that we do routinely direct seed with a specially designed direct seeder that sort of jumps up over the rocks and stuff. But then you also have this interesting state called, which I'm calling sedge-dominated rockland, which where you've still got quite a lot of that ground flora component hanging on. And that's sort of a pretty unique thing if you compare it to other sort of grassy woodland systems across southeastern Australia where that understory component's been totally annihilated. And in those areas we've costed it out, it's at least $10,000 a hectare to put that stuff back. Here you've still got large areas of that ground flora remaining in the landscape. So there's quite a big opportunity that's there. And in our more sort of red wine infused moments, we've kind of talked about like just seeding those areas with sheoak cones out of helicopters, which seems like a pretty crazy idea until you realise that a lot of our weed control is done out of helicopters along the Eyre Peninsula now. And as part of the Biodiversity Fund, we started out sending in teams to do the traditional control of boxthorn through there, but now we realised that we could bring in this hotshot sort of helicopter pilot from up north to and just actually sprinkle some grassland out of very carefully over the top of these boxthorns, and that way we've basically smashed the target and done the whole coast. So it's a bit of a diversion. The point I want to make though is that if really there's a massive sort of cost-effective opportunity to achieve large-scale restoration through targeting sedge-dominated type rocklands. And so mapping those, you can see that they're visible on the aerial maps. So we're able to go through and map out all those areas. And that's what it looks like on the map. So those orange areas are all sort of areas where you have those rocky sedgelands. So we have areas that are sort of target connectivity areas for she oak communities, and then our sand mallee communities in the sort of eastern part of that landscape. So keep moving a bit faster. So we have our, in terms of what we're looking to connect for in the sand mallee component, malleefowl is one of our target species. And so these species distribution modelling approaches such as Maxent. But really the beauty of a species distribution model is that it can be critiqued by people that really know the landscape. Sandhill Dunnart is another sort of target species, and I wouldn't mind checking this strategy with some of the experts in the room. But in terms of the participatory sort of prioritisation component, it's really to kind of important to bring those two things together, so those sort of ecological imperatives, if you like, and those practical sort of feasibility type opportunity factors. And so we went through this process of just basically listing the potential project areas, which are those boxes you saw before, ranking the biodiversity benefits according to the sort of remanency in the area, whether there's threatened species recorded in that area that we're looking to target for. And then we went through and assessed the sort of feasibility factors. So how feasible is it to achieve that change in land use? So if there's less cropping in area in there, that's a good thing. Suitability for revegetation, how much of that rocky sedgeland area is in the target area. And then we came up with an overall sort of priority rank against each area. So we quite clearly realised that there were some priority areas within that landscape as well. And so now we've kind of got it down to a more sort of realistic sort of level, I suppose, where we've got a couple of really targeted projects in the order of sort of 500 to 1,000 hectares per sort of project area, where we can really focus on to sort of get that outcome. So the key learnings. So it's really critical to incorporate that local knowledge, and if you really want to, having a great spatial sort of layer showing where you want to do stuff is great, but if the people that are actually out doing the revegetation work never see it or never have any ownership or participation in that decision-making process, then they won't use it, and so in some ways it's worthless. So it's really important to kind of get that engagement. And also, those practical on-ground issues are really fundamentally important to the work that we're doing, and so getting that feedback from the people that know the landscape and know the landowners is critical as well, and that needs to be accounted for in priority setting. So that's it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. We've probably got time for one or two questions if anyone wants to ask a question.
Using local knowledge, there's been local landholders sort of understand changes in rainfall patterns over time. How do you incorporate that into how you prioritise what vegetation goes back? The fact that over time things have shifted in rainfall, what was once there might not be able to support it again.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's one of the things I've been thinking about at this conference is looking at some of the people getting really serious about adapting to climate change and factoring that into planning, and so I'm starting to think about how we can kind of do that better. But yeah, I probably don't have an answer for you at this point in time, I'm afraid. But I guess the main thing is that you just keep having that conversation going, keep it going, and you can start to bring in some expertise, discuss it with a group, and then redefine the priorities based on that.